Hi folks, so in addition to a framework like Gridism or the more powerful Bootstrap, you can also consider using CSSGrid. And let me just show you where there's a nice tutorial on it right in W3 Schools. If you go to W3 Schools and then go to Learn CSS, and you scroll down and you come down to CSSGrid, and you can just follow these 3 tutorials and learn a heck of a lot out of it right there. In this video tutorial, I'm going to assume that you'll just go over the tutorial in W3 Schools, and I'm going to show you how you can use CSS Grid to make a layout that is similar to the ones that I've already shown you using Gridism and Bootstrap. And the great thing is that we can start with an example that already exists in W3 Schools and then just sort of modify it. So we don't really have to start from scratch. And it's this particular tutorial. You'll find it in this grid item section. You can also just take down this URL to find it. And what you can see here, so let's take a look at it. You can see that just by default, you have this kind of layout here. And let's take a look at the simple stuff first. To begin with, we have a display property whose value is set to grid right here. Okay. And this is what enables the grid and allows us then to make a lot of other associated declarations, CSS declarations, that wouldn't have any impact otherwise, like this grid area here and grid gap and grid template areas, which I'll explain next. So once we've declared the grid, we can also then set the grid gap, which is this thing right here. Let's just change the grid gap just so you can see what it does. So let's change it to 20. You're going to see these lines here get a little larger. And that's what that does. I'm going to put it back to 10 because I like it at 10. And then the padding right here, which changes this outside area. So let's make that 22 for a second. And there you go. And I like it at 10. So let's put that back at 10. Okay. So let's notice here that we have 6 divs inside the grid container. This is the grid container with that display grid right there. That's the selector. If we go down here to the selector, here's the grid container. We notice that there's 6 divs in here, and notice that they're stacked. Okay, and by default, if they were stacked, they would just be also stacked in our display. But notice that they're not. So how does the grid do that? Well, first notice that the first div, okay, this one right here, has a grid area property which has been assigned an arbitrary value, in this case, my area, right up here. So item 1, that div, has been given a grid area property, and then it's just been assigned this my area value. And that my area value can then be used in the grid template areas, this area, this property rather, to define not only the columns and rows of the grid, but also what particular cells in the grid the my area should occupy. And so in this case, there are 5 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? And because they are all associated with the my area value, it means that kind of like a call span, you know, a column span in a table, that the content of item 1, okay, of the item 1 div, is going to span across all 5 rows, which in fact it is, okay? So this div 1 is spanning across all 5 rows. We go back down here, you can see this is the div, you know, item 1, the first div, but it's not stacked, it's actually spanning all 5 rows. And the remaining divs, as we can see, are merely being arranging themselves under these existing columns that we defined up here. Okay. To get a better sense of how the grid works, let's first make the grid 6 columns instead of 5. Okay. So all we need to do here is put another my area in here, like so, and run it again. And now you get that first div spanning 6 columns, and then because there's only 5 left, they come to here, and this one's empty. And notice too that the remaining divs have just sort of rearranged themselves under the 6 columns, but we can rejigger these twos. For example, let's define another row and make the item 2, this one. Let's make the item 2 div span all the columns in that row. And we can basically follow the first row as a model for defining the second one. So first we have to create a new grid area with a div. So if we come up here, just copy this. And make it item 2. And we're going to give it a different value here. We're going to call it hero. I'll tell you why in a second, why we're calling it hero. And then we can make this second row. And a row is basically the areas delineated by these little apostrophes. So our next one here is going to be the apostrophes, and then hero area. Because we want the hero area to extend all the way across, just like the one before it, we're just going to copy it over. And now let's run it and see what we get. And now we have effectively 2 rows in which the divs span all the way across. So think of that top row as the nav, okay, just like in the Bootstrap and the Gridism demo, and then, or the Bootstrap one at least, and then the second row as the place where we're going to put the hero image. In fact, let's relabel the classes and the grid area properties so that they make more semantic sense. And I'll do that right now. First, I'll do the nav area. Oops. And let's just change item 1 to nav as well. So in the classes, make this hero. We change this down below as well. Nav into hero. And run it again. And we're good. So now if we're going to follow the grid pattern of the Bootstrap example, we're also going to want to make 3 columns that span below this. So let's do that next. First, let's make a column 1 and a column 2 and a column 3 and get rid of this 6th one. And then let's go now create the grid areas associated with these. So column 1, column 1 area. Okay. And now I'm just going to make the other 2 behind the scenes. Notice now that I've made the 3 column areas, the column 1 area, column 2 area, column 3 area. And now the only last step I need to do is add that row to my grid template areas here. So column 1 area, okay, and this is going to span two columns, column 1 area, column 2 area, column 2 area, column 3 area. and then we close it with apostrophe like that, and we can run it again, and we got a little problem. Let's fix that. And if you'll notice, there's two semicolons here, and that's what's creating the problem. So if we get rid of that and now run it, we get the same grid layout that we have that we had in our Bootstrap example. And so going from this basic layout to the more finished version is just really a couple more steps, and I'll show them very briefly here in, this is all the same in this code here. All I did was in the hero image, which is located right here, I added an ID and then this background Jumbotron code to give it a background image. And then I added some filler content to the rest of the items in the grid, and that basically you end up with this here. And I will share this code with you below this video so that you can access it and examine it in greater detail. But really, the core of this, the core challenge, is really contained right here in the part of the video I covered. I should note that there is one limitation with the grid. Notice when I let's do this. When I make the screen small, notice that it is stacking, okay? But it won't stack by default. You will actually have to add a media query to make that happen. And I show you in the code how to do that. And here's my media query. And all I'm doing in my media query is changing the grid template areas so that if before we had the column 1 spanning just 2 columns, now it spans entirely across the entire an entire row as it does here. And here column 2 spans across an entire row and 3 across an entire row so that they stack as they're doing here. And so that is one additional step that's not built into CSSGrid that you will find in Bootstrap, but you might like the fact that CSSGrid is built into CSS by default, and it's considerably more lightweight. So you sort of have to sort of weigh the merits and pros and cons of these platforms or approaches as your own and decide which one is best for you. I mean, another I wouldn't call it deficit, but thing that's missing from CSSGrid is, of course, you don't have as sophisticated a nav. You know, with the Bootstrap nav, it'll have a drop down. So that's another thing you're sacrificing. But if you don't need to add those to your page, then I think CSSGrid for basic grid setups is really powerful and a streamlined way to go. Hope this was helpful.